So this is the sort of lecture part of the conference. This is like sort of a hybrid conference. But I have a challenge because I really want to distill this argument in my book, The Human Advantage, briefly. But I also want to give you a taste of the argument. A lot of it will be bare assertion, but I really wanted to diagnose this problem that a lot of officially smart people seem to recognize. And it's essentially this idea that we're in an inflection point technologically and economically, that I think all the most important issues happen. So not just disruption and technological change and innovation, but actually the question about the nature of work and the nature of the human person. I've been fascinated by the debate over artificial intelligence for a long time. Many years ago, I co-authored a book with a guy named Ray Kurzweil when he wasn't so well known, but he's a leading transhumanist, and now is, I think, a vice president at Google. But he thinks we're going to upload ourselves to the internet sometime in the next 30 years and cast off this mortal coil, and it's going to be awesome. I mean, that's sort of basically his worldview. So you get the idea. But you can see how the questions that are at stake in this conference actually come together. They intersect in this question, not just of robotics, but of artificial intelligence. What you might not know is that sometime, and I'd say the last 2 years, at least 20 books have been written that essentially say machines are going to take most or all of our jobs sometime in the next 20 years. A really good representative sample of this is a book by a guy named Martin Ford called The Rise of the Robots. And I talk a lot about Ford in the book only because he's sort of the perfect representative sample of this argument. And here's basically what he says. It's not just that technology can sort of do some scary things. That's not really that interesting of a question. It's something like this. It says, the shift now underway will ultimately challenge one of the most basic assumptions about technology, that machines are tools that increase the productivity of workers. That's what economists will say. Instead, he argues, machines themselves are turning into workers. This is the key problem that people identify. So if you think economically, I'm actually a philosopher that talks a lot about economics, but if you think of the kind of standard economic argument that is brought to bear when you're talking about technological innovation, if technology led to long-term technological unemployment, all of human history would be one long, very depressing story of increased unemployment, right? I mean, this makes absolutely no sense because anytime we innovate in any way, we're essentially making it possible for us to do, in some ways, do more with less, to make some kind of way of working or doing something at that moment obsolete because we find a better way to do it. And of course, economists can point out, they can show you the graphs, they can show you what's happened in economic history. You could say in 1776, 95% of the population was living and working on farms in the United States of America. Today, it's approaching 1% of the population. So if you'd been a prophet in 1776, you might have looked at a primitive steam engine and thought, oh boy, we are all in trouble. What's 94% of the population going to do if in some time in the future, it only takes 1% of the population to feed everyone else? Now think of most of the people working on farms in 1776. How many other options did they actually have? I know some of the stories of my own family on my mom's side. Even my grandfather was affected by this. It basically lost the family farm, couldn't find another farm, had the misfortune of being in the Panhandle of Texas where farms don't work so well in the Panhandle of Texas. It's really dry, and just kind of lived around the edge of the agricultural economy at the time. But you would imagine, okay, so we're going to have this massive unemployment. Instead, what we have is 1% of the population living and working on farms. All of us spend far, far less on food than our ancestors did. And we're all doing other things, including many other things that didn't exist and could not have been imagined in 1776. That's the basic story of economic history, is that we innovate, we make obsolete, and then we find new things and more interesting things to do in many cases. Now, there's a cost to this. I'm not claiming there's no cost. But this idea that everyone's going to end up without work to do, at least if you just look at economic history, seems strange. It seems like, well, you're missing the most basic lessons of economics. But this is essentially the argument. And so if you look at the McKinsey group, if you look at a research group at Oxford University, they say this time is different. And so here I'm going to give you the two basic arguments. I'm going to summarize this entire literature for you in about 30 seconds. So maybe half the books say this. Sometime in the next 20 to 30 years, at least 50% of the jobs that people are now doing are going to disappear, and it's going to be a disaster. And so the government needs to give everybody a universal basic income and just pay people because nobody will have any work to do. All right, so that's the dystopian side. The utopian side is this. In the next 20 to 30 years, most of the jobs that people are now doing are going to get taken over by robots and artificial intelligences, and it's going to be awesome because we're not going to have to do all this stuff, and we're going to be able to just sort of party in the evenings and sleep late and this sort of thing. So that's basically the argument, right? Those are the two sides. Now, honestly, I think as a Catholic, those are both dystopian visions. They are deeply disturbing because they miss the fundamental nature of what it means to be human. I think one of the greatest articulations of this in Catholic social teaching is from John Paul II's 1981 encyclical Laborum Exercens. So this would have been the 90th year after Rerum Novarum, and it's on work. It's talking about what man does through work. And I won't quote this at length, but just hold this one thought in your mind. I suspect that others speaking this week will quote this as well. Here's what he says. He said, "Work is a good thing for man, a good thing for his humanity, because through work, man not only transforms nature, adapting it to his own needs, but he also achieves fulfillment as a human being, and indeed, in a sense, becomes more a human being. That through work, man both fulfills and transforms the world and does what God commanded him to do, right? The man and the woman in Genesis 1, be fruitful and multiply, and then even becomes more of a human being through our work. And so any prediction of the future that says we're not going to have any work to do is ultimately a deeply disturbing vision. Now, it's either true or false. But my argument would be that in part, yeah, we can kind of noodle out what's probably going to happen, but the ultimate deciding factor on this question about artificial intelligence and machines replacing human beings is ultimately down to a philosophical and a metaphysical question. What are machines? What is man? And is man merely a type of machine made of meat, as one person on the other side of this debate put it, or are we something more than a machine? That is the fundamental question, I think one of the fundamental questions of the time. And it can't, I don't think, ultimately be explained, at least satisfactorily, without a philosophical framework, even though we can sort of keep it in economics. So that's the prediction, and that's the predicament. And at the risk of sort of, just basically saying, my conclusion is don't buy it, all right? That's essentially my argument. So all the smart people are saying this. I concede that, right? There's two sides, basically, to the debate, and then I'm arguing for a third side, essentially, which is, no, actually, something is going to happen. There is a real challenge to the information economy that distinguishes it from other inflection points in economic history. But it's not that we are going to have nothing to do. Here's the real challenge of the information economy. It's not actually the end of work, what all these people are predicting, but it's actually the accelerating pace of change and disruption. That disruption I talked about from the agrarian to the industrial economy, which happened in the United States, basically from, you could think of the sort of the time of the American founding to the present. Most of the disruption was done over a period of about 150 years. Now compare that to, say, one piece of technology in my lifetime. When I was a small child and I wanted to listen to music, I was obsessed by the Sound of Music soundtrack. I know that's kind of embarrassing now that I say it, but and my mom had an LP from when she was in college, and I would play the Sound of Music LP. That's for those of you that are younger, it's one of those big retro discs like this, made of vinyl. And then my dad made a major investment in 8-track tapes and had hundreds of dollars worth of 8-track tapes, which is a terrible investment, obviously, which disappeared. And then we had cassette tapes, and then we had CDs, and that's when I kind of got into the action and started buying lots of CDs. And I haven't bought a CD in 8 or 9 years. In fact, think of the way in which we store and transmit music now. It's entirely digital, which we'll talk about in a minute. It's MP3 files, right? That's one thing. That's just the ways in which we store and transmit music in my lifetime have gone through, what is that, about 5 different transformations. That's what we're dealing with in information technology. Profoundly rapid change and disruption, which is going to leave a lot of jobs in a lot of industries, including industry towns that are built around one particular way of working, with some difficult sort of transitions to make. But it doesn't mean that there is nothing left for us to do. So then the question is, okay, so what do we do? How do we prepare for this? So here's my argument, is that the way we prepare for this is we figure out what makes the information economy distinct. How is this transition different? How is an information economy different from, say, the agricultural economy that was 2 stages back? If we can figure out what the key properties are, then we can say, okay, so what do we need to do to match ourselves, our talents, our actions, so that we're fit for that type of economy? Because I'm convinced that it's not as if it's inevitably coming like a physical law, but it is something that in some ways the pace of technological innovation transcends any individual person and our agency. It's a much larger thing than that. So it's not a question of, well, is it going to happen? Or as Catholics, should we just oppose technological change? I don't actually think that's one of the choices. I mean, you could oppose it for yourself, but the stuff's going to happen either way. And so the question is, what do we do about it and how do we channel it toward good? I think that's the key question. So what are the main features of the information economy? I'll just adjust this. Now this is just basically, this is my sort of condensing of the literature. And so if some of you read on this subject, you may be familiar with some of this, and some of this is just sort of my own. This is what I think the main features of the information economy are. That is, at least those things that distinguish it. First is what I've already mentioned, is that it's highly disruptive. Let's just treat that as a cost. Everybody sort of understands what that means. Second, and related to it, is that the growth, at least in the information part of the economy, is exponential. So the growth rates are exponential rather than merely linear. Anybody that's read Wired magazine is familiar with that idea. Third, it's digital. Now, it's a word that we all use probably every day, but what exactly that means and why it matters economically, I think, is key to getting how the information economy is different from what's actually happened before. 4, it's hyper-connected. Everyone with a child knows exactly what I'm talking about this, because we spend all day trying to keep it from getting even more hyper-connected with demonic things like Snapchat that our children get on, and we don't know how to turn it off, these sorts of things. You know what hyper-connected is, right? And we'll talk a little bit about why that matters. And then finally, it is ever more informational. And I think this is the sort of key fact to remember and the key fact to reckon with. So let me give you just a few minute kind of brief description of what these 5 things mean, but I've already told you what disruptive is. So the other 4, so that you know what, this is essentially my diagnosis and description of the economy, and then what I think we should actually do as a result of it. The first is exponential. Most of you have probably heard of this idea, Moore's Law, which describes, effectively it describes the growth rate of computing power of a microprocessor in a computer, and it's named after a guy named Gordon Moore, who was a co-founder of Intel Corporation when he was at Fairchild Semiconductor in the 1960s. He noticed at the time that engineers, about every 18 to 24 months, were able to put twice the number of transistors on an integrated circuit than they were before. So in other words, you had a doubling of the capacity of these integrated circuits every 18 to 24 months. So you got to think for a second. So doubling means that we've got exponential growth. So this isn't 1, 2, 3, 4. This is 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, 64, 128, 256. It really gets crazy very, very quickly. And he thought, now, maybe that's unusual because that means that the computers are getting really fast and really powerful really, really quickly, and they're sort of outstripping other things in the economy. He thought it would go on for about 10 years. Well, at least to the moment, we're now in 2018, it's still going. This trend is still going. And when Moore first noticed it, people thought, well, this has something to do with the physics of crystalline silica. It has to do with the matter, the material that we're making these computer chips out of. And so it's limited to these just quirky physical properties. What's funny is this guy named Ray Kurzweil that I mentioned a few years ago picked up on this years ago And he made an argument for what he called the law of accelerating returns. Now, he takes this to sort of extreme lengths. He argues that you can interpret cosmic history and life and everything in terms of this kind of exponential growth trend. And so don't take all of his extremes. But he did one very important thing, is he said, I wonder how long Moore's law has been holding. Because when Gordon Moore noticed it in 65, this was the fifth physical type of computation that we had had in the 20th century. So what Kurzweil did is he traced it back. So basically computational speed, or as he defined it, amount of computation or speed of computation for $1,000, essentially, going back 100 years. And you know what he discovered? Discovered exponential growth in computing power across 5 different physical media. So what that means is that there's this trend of exponential growth, and it transcends the physics of what the computation is using. Essentially, it's something more than that. Now, does this mean it's inevitable or that it's a law of physics? No. It does mean that it's a profound trend. And it might not seem, because of the fact that our intuitions don't work well with exponential growth, it might not seem like this is all that big a deal. But Kurzweil boiled it down in a piece in 2013 in the Wall Street Journal. Here's how he put it. He said, a kid in Africa with a smartphone is walking around with $1 trillion of computation circa 1970. In 1961, it would have taken $8.3 trillion to buy the same computing power that you get for 8 cents in 2013. All right, that's Moore's law just applied to computer power, okay? So just this one component. And if you read Kurzweil's big fat book from about 10 years ago called The Singularity is Near, he points out that this is happening all across the information economy. If you read George Gilder's new book, Life After Google, we'll talk about that on Friday, he actually points out there's things like growth in storage capacity is dwarfing Moore's law. Moore's law seems silly and trivial and slow, like geological timescales compared to what's happening in store width and things like this. So in other words, in this segment of the economy that we'll call the information part, this isn't happening in energy, by the way. Alas, there is no Moore's law with respect to sort of miles per gallon on cars. Not yet, anyway. So we're talking about the information part of the economy. You've got exponential growth that is leading both to amazing innovation and change, but also to radical disruption. That's a key feature of this economy. Number 2 is that it's digital. All right, what does it mean that it's digital? Digital is one of these words, I actually, until I was, I don't know, probably in high school, thought the word digital actually just meant a clock that had numbers on it rather than analog, I think, because that's what I learned when my dad first got one of these watches. There's a great book by 2 guys at MIT named Eric Brynjolfsson and Andrew McAfee. And here's how they describe digitization. They say it's the work of turning all kinds of information in media, text, sounds, photos, video, data from instruments and sensors into the ones and zeros that are the native language of computers and their kin. All right, or to put it more simply in the literature, is that digitization is the movement from the world of atoms to the world of bits. It's that movement from having to store things in a physical medium. I just think it's a slightly metaphorical, but having to have a CD versus having a kind of integrated network in which I don't actually need a physical thing exactly. I need code that can then translate the music. That's digitization. The movement from the world of molecules and atoms to the world of bits. Now, what a bit is bit is just a unit of information developed by the information theorist Claude Shannon in the 1950s. He was trying to figure out how to measure how much sort of how big of a transmission you could get across a line and distinguish signal from noise, and be a way, or is there a way to compress signals and things like that. He developed this idea of a measure of information. So what is a bit exactly? Well, a bit is essentially what Shannon said is information for him. He didn't get the whole thing, but it's essentially the resolution of surprise. And so if I have a quarter, I would have a quarter, except I don't actually use cash anymore, so I never actually have one in my pocket. But if I had a quarter, we pick it up, right, and I show it to you, it's a fair coin, so it's heads or tails beforehand. So think of that as the field of possibility. It's an information-free context. Then I flip it, It comes down, say it comes down tails. That's 1 bit of information. So what has happened is that there's a bit of surprise. You didn't know for sure, was it going to be heads or tails? And so the information in this sense is just a kind of collapse from a field of possibility to one concrete actuality. And then if I flip it a number of times, the number of bits goes up very quickly, okay, depending upon whatever the sequence is. That's a bit of information. That's where you get all the language of computer science, is from this idea that you can measure the amount of information in something, which is very strange, because if you think about it, information isn't ultimately a physical quantity, as one information theorist said. It's not matter, it's not energy, it's some third thing, and yet we can measure it. Okay, so this is a kind of key point. Now, why does this matter economically? It matters because digital goods are different from physical goods in many ways. And here are the 2 key properties. Okay, so these are 2 kind of economic take-home lessons, is that digital goods generally are non-rival and they have near zero marginal cost. So imagine an Encyclopedia Britannica set, which I'm guessing some people still buy these. I looked it up, and you can buy them. It's a whole set, right? So if I own a set of Encyclopedia Britannica, it takes up space and volume, glue, paper. It's expensive to produce. They could reduce the costs per set, right, by producing 1 million sets at a time. Still, every new set's going to take money to transport and store and print and all those kinds of things. That means it's a rival good. So if I own a set of Encyclopedia Britannica and I keep it in my house, you can't also have it. So many of the things we think of in economics are like that. You know, in a sense, they're a zero-sum game. I can enjoy this. I can enjoy this new car and keep it and buy it, but then you can't have it. All right, so that's a rival good. And then usually rival goods like this are also, they don't have anything like a zero marginal cost. Every new copy of it costs something significant. Now compare that to a subscription to the Encyclopedia Britannica online. First of all, it's way better than the set because you get all this integration and video, right? But also, if you get a subscription, you don't just deplete the store of copies of the Encyclopedia Britannica subscriptions. If you download a song for $1.29 from iTunes, you didn't just remove 1 copy. That's not how it works. Moreover, once the infrastructure is in place, the actual cost, right, there's a little electricity. I know there's some cost. It's not literally zero. But it's vanishingly close to zero for each additional copy of that digital good. Now, that is profoundly important because of what it means is that insofar as economics is always about scarcity, we're now in this weird context in which you have this weird kind of abundance, in which you have more and more goods that are made that have virtually zero marginal cost, once all the system is set up, of course, and they're non-rival goods. So there's a non-zero-sum game, right? Now that's digitization. And so the more and more things that can be digitized, the more and more they're going to obey the rules of the information economy and of information and not machines and physical commodities and things like that economists are used to thinking about. Next is that the economy is hyper-connected. This really doesn't deserve, I think, kind of any explanation, except just to marvel at the moment in which we live. And most of us, especially if you're a parent, are frustrated by this fact, both by our own distraction of being constantly connected with our iPhones and our children constantly talking to each other when they're in the same room, over the iPhones, right? I don't understand this. And so we notice sort of the cost, but we don't also notice the benefits. It's an editor of Wired magazine, Kevin Kelly, in his recent book, The Inevitable. And he said 1,000 years from now, if people are still around, they'll look back at this moment at the beginning of the 21st century and say, what a magical time that was. Because it was at that moment that for the first time, the human race as a whole connected itself to one thing. Already, the majority of the human population is essentially connected to each other at roughly the speed of light. That is a new thing in all of human history. It's a new thing of just a few decades ago. And in fact, the smartphone part of it, remember when the first iPhone came out, that was just 2007. So this stuff is just getting started. And if you know anything about networking theory, there's a term called Metcalfe's law. It was actually coined by George Gilder, who'll be here on Friday. And Metcalfe's law, essentially, it's like Moore's law applied to networks. And so it basically says that the value of a network goes up as the square of the number of users in the network, which really, it just means the value goes up really, really fast, essentially. And so if you have, it's often said the guy that sold the first telephone is the greatest salesman in history. Okay, so you got to think about this, right? One phone, totally useless. Until somebody else has a phone, it's connected to your phone, and you actually want to talk to them. Then you can have a conversation. Now add 2 or 3 or 4 more people, and all of a sudden you've got this spiraling number, this proliferation of interconnections that was not possible before. That's hyperconnectivity, and that is a driving feature of the information economy. And then finally, information. It's not just information itself, because in fact, every economic act, every creation of value is in a sense an act of information. The first man that first thought to chip together 2 flint rocks to start a controlled fire to cook some elk or something in a cave, that was an informational act in the sense that he was constraining what nature could do on its own toward a purposeful end to start a controlled fire. So that's informational in a sense. But nevertheless, economies for most of human history, mostly the physics and the kind of physical components have been the key feature. But a key feature of the information economy is that it becomes ever more informational, in which either pure or mostly the informational part of the economy is the part that's important. Now, we all talk about this. I've been using the word information economy all the time. But ask yourself, what exactly is information? I'm not expecting anyone to raise their hand. It's sort of rhetorical, but I just want you to think about it. If you had to define it, what exactly is it? You might say, well, it's news, it's stuff that I want to know, it's bits, it's bytes. I don't know exactly. It's very odd. It's related actually to a couple of eidos in the Greek, which is idea, informare. It's related to a classical idea of form. Form is the thing that you are. It's also the forms, the ideas in the mind of God or God's exemplars. And information comes from that idea. Notice, information. It has the word form in it. And I don't think that's a coincidence, though people don't often reflect on it. Because a form is something that's in the mind. In classical Christian theology, it's preeminently in the mind of God, and then he creates things that exemplify forms. We are humans. That is our form, for instance. But we sort of lost sight of that. And yet, if you actually look at the literature on information theory, this is a perennial question. In fact, there's an amazingly large and robust book on this a few years ago by a guy named James Gleick, who's a journalist and very smart guy. The whole book is about information, and at the end it finally just collapses. And he just says, well, it's something physical, I guess. I don't know, come on. It's crazy. And so let me just try to distill this for you, because this is the kind of the key point. Some of you may have been to Victoria, British Columbia, which is a beautiful place. It's in the bottom of Vancouver Island in the basically far western part of Canada, kind of north of Seattle. The amazing thing about Victoria is it's got this protected harbor. It's actually got 2 harbors. And so if you take a ferry from Port Townsend or Vancouver into Victoria, do this, by the way, in the summer if you want to enjoy it. It's dark there in the winter. And you go in, and very quickly you're in the initial harbor. It's already quite still and settled. And then you keep going. It keeps getting narrower. And then you enter in to the inner harbor of Victoria. And it is so placid and peaceful. Remember, this is the ocean. Basically the governmental seat of power, you see this lit building here, is right by the water. It would be like putting, the U.S. Capitol just sort of on the beach somewhere in North Carolina. I mean, you obviously wouldn't do this. But that tells you how protected this harbor is. And you go in, if you're there in the summer, the first time I did this, you might notice there's something on the kind of grassy hill on the side of the harbor. But it's actually very hard to see, especially if you come in at night. You might be able to see it in this picture. Here's a daytime picture. Try to look carefully and see if you can see what that is. If not, I'll make it easier. I'll circle it. It's red and yellow begonias. That spell, welcome to Victoria. All right, now everyone that knows English, at least, and I suspect everyone that doesn't know English, immediately when we see this, we know that's information. We don't do probability calculations and say, okay, what are the chances that Canadian geese flying south, carrying begonia seeds might, do their business, accidentally drop a bunch of seeds and fall out in this way? That's logically possible. And so you might just say, well, it's just really improbable, or it's complex, which are more or less the same thing. But you know what? If we randomly scattered seeds, that would be a complex and improbable pattern too. It'd be very hard to reconstruct, but we wouldn't say that's informational. So what's happening here? We are very good at recognizing information when we see it. Now, sometimes information can be embedded and coded. That's what cryptography is about, in which information is there, but it's hidden, has to be discovered. So the question is, what is information? It's more than just mere surprise. It's more than just mere kind of running up a bunch of bits. Because here's the thing about Shannon's definition of information, and the information that gets talked about in computer theory, is that if I have a sentence, let's say a meaningful sentence that says, "Methinks it's like a weasel," you can count how many bits of information are in that, all right? I'm not going to do it, but you can. It's a number of possible letters and spaces and things like that. Now, I could jumble that up, same letters in different sequences. It would have the same bits of information, right? So it's just a bunch of random coin flips. But you know the information's now been lost. So what that means is that there's a kind of reductive understanding of information that's perfectly fine if all you're trying to figure out is you don't care what the meaning of the transmission across the line is. All you care about is, okay, can I compress it, or how long does it take to transmit? That's fine. But if you want to know the nature of information, you got to go beyond that. And part of the reason I would argue that people don't like to go beyond that is because of its metaphysical and philosophical implications. Because when you see that information there, when you see "Welcome to Victoria," you recognize that it is a message. How do you recognize that? In part, it's because of complexity or improbability. If there weren't lots of different letters that could mean different things, then you couldn't use them to code information. It turns out you just need a 0 and a 1, or a plus or a minus. You can code pretty much anything you want, but you need variation. Right? And so words mean different things based on the sequences, right? So complexity or improbability is half the story. But again, mere complexity or improbability isn't information, because again, a jumbled list of letters is informational in that sense. Real information that has meaning is also specified. It conforms to an independently given pattern. And in this case, you recognize it because you know when you're in Victoria, you know the meaning of the English language and syntax, you know how language is spelled, and so you see it immediately. Now, why have I spent 5 minutes on what might seem like a very arid subject, and is probably an arid subject? It's because the essence of the information economy is the profusion and increase in the production of useful and value-creating information. And intelligent agents have an exclusive jurisdiction on the creation of that kind of information. This is what makes us agents. It is what distinguishes us from machines. It's what distinguishes us from mere laws of physics, which can do very good things repetitively. But the creation of that kind of information is reserved to agents. And as one information theorist said, that we habitually associate the creation of new information with the presence and activities of an intelligent agent. This was not a theological statement. This is just straight out of the observations on information. So I hope you can see how profoundly important that is. So then we have a moment to sort of answer the question, only very few moments, how not to be replaced by robots. We focus on essentially, it's simple for an economist, we focus on our comparative advantage. There are going to be many things that machines will be doing and will do better than we can do them. That's why we make machines. That's why we make wheelbarrows. It shouldn't make us feel displaced in the cosmic scheme of things because, the wheelbarrow can lift more than me, right? That's why we made it. The calculator can calculate more quickly than I can. Of course, that's why we made it. It doesn't replace us. It augments us, and it might replace a thing we do. It does not replace us. It's the same thing with information technology. What we need to do is to focus on those things that make us uniquely human, that distinguish us from mere machines. And what is that exactly? Well, what does it mean to be an agent? To be an agent, to be a person, is to exercise freedom, to have consciousness, to have subjective first-person experience, to be able to choose from alternatives, and to act for a purpose. Right? That's at least part of what it means to be a person. is that we can act freely for purposes. And because we can do that, as John Paul said, when we work and when we act and when we do good things habitually, we can become more than we were before. That's what the development of virtue is about. We have the capacity to develop virtue simply by virtue of being made as human beings. But what we do with that is very much up to us and to the context in which we grow up and how we respond to it. A virtue is essentially something that starts on the inside as an act of the will in which you do something with your mouth or do something with your body, and then you do it over and over with intention and direction over and over, and it becomes a habit. And then if you do it long enough, it becomes an automatic thing that you do. So it's not just something you keep having to think to do, even you're doing automatically, but it becomes a part of what and who you are. So you make yourself more than you were at the beginning. That is something that only agents can do. And so the basic virtues, despite an information economy, are still really important. I tell my children this, I tell students this at CUA. Actually, learning to show up on time is a really useful skill. Writing a single sentence coherently is a really useful skill. Graduate from high school, wait until you're married to have kids, get a job, and as Carly Fiorina said, just do it really well. If you do those things in the United States, you might not be fabulously successful or wealthy, you won't be impoverished. Nevertheless, treat those as the kind of basic virtues that everybody is still going to need and is always needed. But there's still other virtues that I would argue are sort of specifically important because of the information economy. And these are virtues that correspond to those 5 features of the information economy. And I'll just list them briefly. I'm not going to spend any time on it. But what I want you to see is that each of these will optimize us, optimizes students, optimizes our children to succeed in an information economy because it essentially exploits the nature of that economy. Courage is important. It's always been important. But if you think about it, for most of human history, people didn't really so much have to cultivate courage because it was forced upon them. If you're of Irish ancestry and you have Irish ancestors that came here in maybe the early 19th century from Ireland, they weren't sitting around saying, I don't know if I want to do an MBA or go to law school or maybe I'll go to medical school or there's this nonprofit my uncle is running or maybe I'll get on a boat. No, it's shall I starve? This is essentially the choice. Shall I starve or be oppressed or get on a boat with my family and go to a country I've never gone to before and never see any of my family and friends again? Right? So that kind of coerces courageous acts. The truth of the matter is none of us have to deal with things like that. Nobody's going to starve to death. And so what that means is we have to cultivate courage. Courage in this case is the willingness to act in the presence of failure. And it's especially important in a disruptive economy because what that means is that several things you will likely try when you graduate from college, you might fail at. And so you need to be prepared to have that happen. Maybe try several things over the first 5 years after you get out of college. Don't assume that I'm going to have a college degree in 4 years and that's going to prepare me that I'm going to work for the same company and do the same thing for 40 years. Those days are mostly over. Your education will be continuous education because you're going to constantly be learning to do new things. So courage is absolutely important. But courage and the willingness to fail is by itself not a formula for success. You can actually just keep failing, right? That's a possibility. And so in addition to courage, you need the capacity of what's called antifragility as a virtue. This is from Nicholas Nassim Taleb's book, Antifragile. And antifragility, you might think of something's fragile, it's easy to break, right? So you perturb it and it breaks easily. Well, what is the opposite of that? You might think, well, something's really strong and robust, like rebar. Yeah, that's true, but even rebar, if you bend it, it can bend and it can snap and be brittle. There's actually this third thing, this third property of systems, and it's this ability to actually improve under perturbation and stress. That's how biological systems are. I'm going to run forward to my picture here so you know what I'm talking about. Everybody knows what courage looks like. That's what it looks like if you're wondering. This is what antifragility looks like. It's a hallmark of biological systems. If you lift weights and you have good the capacity like this guy to put on a lot of muscle, and you lift weights really hard, right? You tear the muscle fibers. You actually create an inflammatory response. And then you rest and you eat, and your body rebuilds it more strongly than it was before. That's antifragility. So what's antifragility with a virtue, as a virtue? What it is that first the capacity and willingness to fail, and then the ability always to learn something new and to grow in some important way as a result of failure. So it's not just a simple isolated data point, but it becomes part of who you are. Read Scott Adams' hilarious book, How to Fail at Almost Everything and Still Win Big. Half the book is just all the really, really stupid ideas he's come up with over the years. Finally came up with the Dilbert cartoon, which made it big. But what he did is he had a bunch of things he was not very good at. It was actually bad, but decent at several things. And then he put them together in what he called a talent stack. And he's the unique person in the universe with now this set of skills. That's antifragility. And then finally, I'll just finish up with these. Altruism. Altruism is just the capacity to create and willingness to create value for other people. That's always been important, but it's really important now, and it's really valuable now because in a digital world with non-rival goods, right, the capacity for creating value and creating things that were not there is unbelievable, whether it's handmade goods that you sell over Etsy or workout videos that you can upload in Sammamish, Washington, and women in their bedrooms in Saudi Arabia will benefit from them. This is one amazing success story I tell in the book. And then collaboration, which is obvious. The humility and willingness to work with and to benefit from the work of others. And then finally, creative freedom. What is creative freedom? It's not just creativity, and it's not just mere freedom. Mere freedom is that ability to choose between alternatives. So think of the little girl whose parents buy her a piano, put it in the living room and say, honey, you're free to play this piano whenever you want to. And she's 5 years old. And so in a sense, she's free, right? She can go in there. Her parents don't chastise her if she plunks notes on the keyboard. But is she free to play Rachmaninoff or Beethoven's Fifth? No. How would she acquire that freedom? That freedom would require discipline. Would require her channeling herself into boring stuff every single day for a purpose, scales, and playing sections over and over and over. And then after about 10 years of this, she'll eventually play that movement in Moonlight Sonata that nobody plays because it's so darned hard. That is a higher order type of freedom that's not just choosing different kinds of ice cream. It's channeling and disciplining yourself in an informational and purposeful way, right, to achieve something that was not possible before. So it's a type of freedom, but it's a freedom transformed and focused on doing something purposeful. And in the economic sense, it's something that is focusing on the needs and the values of others and channeling yourself to do that. There's never been a greater time in the world than the moment in which we live to do just that. The irony is that these amazing machines we're making, the remarkable networking machines and the weak artificial intelligence, not Skynet and the robots that are supposedly going to become conscious, not going to happen, but amazing things that we're making will cause us very often to attribute agency and significance to the machines and to relegate ourselves to a position of insignificance. This is false consciousness. What we ought to do if we're going to do anything is to focus on these amazing artifacts, these machines, and to say, who made these? We made these. Homo sapiens, creature wise man. Homo faber, man the maker of machines. We are beings made in the image of the creative God. God creates the sand, and then he leaves it to us to create the fiber optic cables and the computer chips made of sand. As Thomas Aquinas said, God grants to creatures the dignity of causality, and he grants to us the dignity of creative freedom. Thank you very much.